For Radio Western, this is Kevin Heslop here with Susan Elmslie to discuss her second full-length collection of poems, Museum of Kindness, in anticipation of her reading at Landon Library Wednesday, February 20th at 7:30 for Poetry London. This collection, published in 2017 by Brick Books, was originally titled Genre. Literary genre you've mentioned is only ever named after it has ended, and the four sections of this collection seem to correspond to epochs or genres of your life, which you were able to name and so allowed to conclude. However, the second title you were to use for this book, Susan, was Impossible Genre, and I wonder if that shift from genre to impossible genre indicates a kind of revelation that the personal experiences these poems recount cannot be tidily put to bed because they're, so to speak, still ongoing.
Yeah, in fact, I would just modify that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
The second title was the Unnameable Genre.
Oh, okay.
So just remaining elusive. But yes, many genres get their names when people sort of look back retrospectively and notice patterns in them. And the Unnameable Genre was an idea for me that still, yes, it was elusive to language, that didn't that eluded our ability to name it yet, or that it was outside somehow of fixed experience.
I wonder about how your relationship with Museum of Kindness has changed since its publication about a year and a half or so ago. I'm sort of imagining the experience that film actors go through. Sort of a year after they'd wrapped shooting, they're expected to sort of discuss the book. And I know that you've been doing interviews about this book for about a year and a half. So how has your sense of the genres it contains evolved? How is your relationship with the book different now?
Well, I guess I'm less afraid of it. When I was writing those poems, I had a lot. It was hard to go into the territory in any kind of intense way, and so the writing of some of the work was difficult because you have to sort of steel yourself or prepare yourself to look at stuff that was hard to look at. And then I was afraid of how other people would view that work. I thought, well, so the good part is that not that many people will see it because it is poetry, and there will be a small audience for it, so I don't have to worry too much about that, which was kind of a small consoling irony. But I feel less afraid of it now that it's out. I feel like I confronted my ideas about how people might receive it before it came out.
How did you anticipate their receiving it? Like, what did you expect to be greeted by or met by?
Well, I did think at some point during it, well, I'm writing a book that no one will want to read because it deals with experience that most people don't want to live through in terms of, say, the school shooting. It's a small sort of club that nobody wants to be a member of, and also, the experience of birthing and then raising a child that needs hospital care and has a condition that causes parents a lot of worry, and then the kind of attentiveness that's required. Some people don't want to go to those places in poetry. I know, say, Sharon Olds' book, The Father, somebody gave to me when my father was sick and dying, and I could not read that book until about the 1-year anniversary after my father's death.
Well, I mean, one of the reasons perhaps why it had been as consoling as it was the year after your father's death was that somebody had sort of gone to that depth and been willing to. I mean, do you feel? I mean,
that's why I wrote those poems. That's why I wrote it, because I thought it's my obligation, as an artist, to look at the hard stuff in life and be able to connect with others over it, say something that might resonate with somebody else. Yeah.
I wonder whether students or faculty who were at Dawson College in September of 2006 have read the poems, and whether you've spoken with them, and whether they'd had an experience similar to the one of your reading Sharon Old's book a year after your father's death, that it consoled.
I'm not sure about that, but I remember that before the poems were published in a journal or in the book itself, I did a reading at a PED day at Dawson that many faculty attended, and I read those poems, some of them that are now in the collection. And there were people in the audience who were there, and I remember somebody connecting particularly with the poem about the shooter, the poem If.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful, beautiful poem, that.
Oh, thank you. She felt glad that somebody wrote about it without sort of demonizing the shooter, and, seeing the shooters involved in these sorts of terrible events as redeemable somehow, if we could get it before it happens, that she was glad, and so that meant a lot to me.
So I'll just say for the listener that that If consists of a sort of a litany of imagined options or possibilities had the shooter in this case had the opportunity to have, I think one of them is sort of learn to play guitar, or there are about 25 of these different imagined possibilities that would have led him down a different path.
Yeah, that would have let him give peace a chance, or
right.
Yeah.
There's a technique that I noticed throughout the book, which felt to me like a kind of like the lingual equivalent or the poetic equivalent of grieving. So with the relaxed pantoum of strict bed rest, for example, you seem to propose the repetition of lines as a kind of means by which to poeticize grief. These repetitions approach a kind of lingual therapy akin to the desensitization obtained by repeatedly reliving trauma. This process is even more apparent in There Is Never Just One Trauma, the therapist says, which essentially reshuffles several lines like an ongoing, self-contained found poem. I'd wonder if you'd share a few words about the process of composing these poems and what the rhythms of grief have taught you about what poetry can do in some sort of utilitarian sense as the balm after the lashing.
Okay. That poem, There's Never Just One Trauma, the therapist says, is a palindrome.
Oh.
And for me, that connected with the kind of EMDR or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy that I had,
Right.
to process the trauma of the shooting. And because the therapist did say there's never just one trauma, that the way that people experience PTSD is usually because some earlier trauma might have been triggered, because not all people get that kind of reaction to a disaster or what have you. So that form seemed to fit really well, in my view, with kind of therapy, with the idea of revisiting and the mind's gymnastics, as I say in the poem, what we can do with our mind. And I did definitely and always do think of the appropriate form that something should take when I'm writing. I don't always know right away. In fact, that's sometimes one of the midway things that I do. I wouldn't say it's at the very end, but deciding on form or letting the form sort of find me is really key, because there's a clear match for me between the form that's chosen and the poem itself. They connect very closely. For me as a writer, and I tell this to my students too, that it's not really therapy, but it does afford an opportunity to process experience. So Wordsworth's idea of emotion recollected in tranquility, especially if that emotion is really intense, can be understood really fully, or processed, I guess, in the writing of a poem where you don't know exactly where you're going to go with it.
I suppose that the early recollections or attempts at writing, your experience at Dawson College in that day, I understand it took quite a while before you were able to write those poems, and I suspect that it wasn't very tranquil, the early tranquility of those first recollections. Yeah.
No, you're right. I mean, I think I wrote the one called School Shooting fairly soon after, maybe within a year.
And didn't really touch it afterwards, right? It was
right for a long time, and yes, because with events like that, sometimes you feel like there's nothing you can say. I know that Bob Hickok, who teaches creative writing at Virginia Tech, where they experienced a terrible shooting not long after Dawson's, features that notion that there's nothing much to say, or that it's impossible to say, which is I think something that one struggles with. And so they're really only from my perspective, and that's all that I could really talk about. If I wanted to say more, I'd have to probably, that's not my perspective only, I'd have to write an essay or work in some other genre.
I mean, is there a way in which you're speaking about your personal perspective and the detail that comes along with that, although these are experiences that wouldn't necessarily be shared by, fortunately, I suppose, by the majority of people in this case, that there's a way that it sort of universalizes, Like, it seemed to become almost, some of these poems almost become like, as I was reading them, anthem is too sort of celebratory and patriotic a term, but they're sort of like, they're encapsulatory in a way of that experience, in a way that feels like it transcends the personal.
I hope so. That's a very, very nice thing for you to say, and that, when I teach creative writing, I always tell my students, you may think it's sort of counterintuitive, but you may think that by leaving something very general, you're making it more relatable to more people, but in fact, I find the opposite to be true for my own reading, that the more specific, the more particular, the more precise, the more I can feel the emotion that the writer constructs in the speaker for me to, I feel it more. So that, I knew that these things would not necessarily resonate with anybody who's had that experience of being present for such an event that is, terrifying. And I also worried about how the family of Anastasia D'Souza, who died in that shooting, if they ever heard these poems, how they would feel about that. So I had a sense of dread and responsibility, but also I felt that there's a lot of silence around these kinds of events, and they tend to be, formulaic in the media's representation of them, and I just wanted to resist that through telling my own story.
So I'd read in an interview when you were asked about the piece of advice that was most sort of resonant for you, so was don't be afraid, and then you quickly mentioned that that Robert Hass had told you once sometimes it's better to risk too much, and that had echoed a line by Czesław Miłosz where he says it's better sometimes to be a little bit ashamed than silent. And Hass has this sequence of poems called Patches of Snow in July, which sort of recount the death of people during a particular time, like sort of from the ages of, like when the death of a newborn, and then from ages 1 to 5, sort of 5 to 10, and then in one's teens and one's 20s and 30s and so forth. And one of the way that he begins one of them, I think the one to commemorate the death of newborns, is almost as if one shouldn't speak of it. And I wonder if that sort of connects a bit with how you were to approach the poem that you ultimately wrote for Anastasia, which allow me to add, I thought it was a really beautiful, moving tribute. And
Oh, thank you. Yes, I mean, I think I faced outright the inadequacy of initial attempts to try to. I could not write these poems without speaking of her, and I found that nothing was adequate to it either, to addressing that loss.
but also that it would have been a betrayal in a weird way if she wasn't included, right? Like it was a
Yes.
necessary step
It
for you to
wasn't
take.
necessary, and so to risk too much, to acknowledge that the risk may be a failure is something that we can do in poetry, and in life. And I think that another question I asked Robert Hass was, how do you know when irony is not working, or because it seems to be the characteristic mode of a lot of writing today, because nobody wants to be caught to be too sincere, or certainly not sentimental. But how do you avoid talking about something that's deeply important and moving, and avoid irony? And that was partly what he was responding to there, that sometimes it's good to risk too much.
So he hosts, occasionally he hosts the Lunch Poem series at UC Berkeley, and they had Lee Young Lee come through, who I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work, but Haas says in his introductory remarks to Lee Young Lee something like, it seemed like it was I can't remember exactly the word they used, but it was interesting to see an American make that move towards actually it's deeper than sentimentality. It's almost, it's too sort of rooted to the very core of deeply personal emotional experiences that Lee Young Lee.
Are those on podcasts? Is that where you heard that? Or were you there?
I found them on YouTube.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, the Lunch Poem series. They've done several.
That.
I'm sorry?
I'm going to look at that.
Oh, they're fantastic. And he offers introductory remarks, and just, does this extraordinary sort of almost free associative, or like free flight kind of jazz-like collections of associations that he had experienced reading the book, and then roots them in a chronology in just an extraordinarily masterful way. It's really fascinating. Anyway, here's a kind of maybe a toss-off question. What can a poem not do without?
Well, yes, that's a tough one. I think that there are so many different kinds of poems that it's impossible to say, that a poem can't do without one single thing. There's found poetry and sound poetry and concrete and visual poetry, and I don't want to start with the premise that it is, poetry for the page even. But when I teach poetry, I tell students that I think that most of the forms that I've come across have one of three strategies, and I sort of schematize that as an acronym, ARC, because, for the R and ARC, it's repetition. There's repetitions on so many different levels, and the C is for compression or condensation. And the A is the toughest one. It's accumulation or accretion of meaning, which can happen on lots of different levels. I think that a poem has to have some kind of pattern. That's about it. Pattern, even pattern in non-pattern. I like to have surprise in a poem. I like to see tension in a poem. But I guess what can a poem not do without? Well, it can even survive without a reader. But hopefully, it needs a reader.
So I wonder if part of the reason why surprise can be compelling is because you recognize that the person has begun in a way that they've ended in a way that they didn't expect when they began. Like that the reader was, or the writer rather, was first surprised that there was a discovery on their behalf. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's a well-known phrase associated with Robert Frost is, No surprise in the writer, no surprise in the reader, no tears in the writer, no tears in the reader. And so sometimes in the making of a poem, yes, you see that you said what you thought might be the opposite initially of what you had the impulse of saying, and that surprise in itself sometimes can make a better poem.
I'd once heard it said at a writing workshop that the poem doesn't necessarily begin when you began the poem. Like, you could write several lines and then the poem begins. You have to kind of clear out some kind of some errata or matter before the poem actually begins to take its form. In parallel with that idea of you begin in a way that you don't necessarily know where you're going to go and when you begin. And on that point, I wonder about sort of detritus and like the clearing out of the unnecessary, and maybe tying in with the C of that acronym, compression. How your experience working with Elena Muntz as your editor in this collection, what she did as an editor that you couldn't do for yourself, and what that relationship was like.
Yeah. Wow, I feel so fortunate to have worked with Elena. One of the things she did initially was flag many. I'm not even sure how many ultimately she flagged, and that she flagged them for removal from the manuscript. And I tend to write a longer manuscript because I feel like that might happen. And it's true. She did say this could go. Let's see if we can get it, tighter. And she did also say during that period, because I asked for the longest possible window of editing that Brick could give me. So it was essentially almost a 2-year period of. There was some rewriting, some new writing in there too. I was many came out and some new ones came in. And then she was really good at saying why something wasn't necessary. And there was some back and forth there where I, held on to things, and which I guess is, like when somebody helps you clean out your closet, but that still fits.
Right.
I like that. I had that since I was 12, There's some of that, and then you got to, at some point, really look at it coldly and say, can this go? And if it could, that's the direction we moved in. So she was really good at that. I could not have done that much by myself of the purge and the really tough editing.
Would you run poems or even like sections past trusted readers? I know your husband's he's a scholar of Shakespeare. Obviously, deeply capable
for that.
reader.
Sometimes I feel like I'm troubling him by reading a poem because our lives are so busy that we barely have time to talk about work and stuff like that. But sometimes I'm really desperate to hear how something appears to someone right away. I'll show him a poem, and he'll usually have one thing to say about it, which is helpful. I have a couple of friends I've shown work to. Sarah Van Art, who's going to have a book coming out with Brick shortly. I'm not sure what season exactly, and Rachel Rose, who I've been friends with for a very long time. I show her poems, and another friend, Miss Sarah Van Eyck, to whom the book is dedicated. She sees occasional early poems too, but I don't have a definite first reader like some people do that, you show them everything and they've seen the whole manuscript. Some poems were not seen by anybody before they were sent out in the manuscript.
I think that we are drawing to a close, unfortunately, and I'd like, if I may, ask you to read a poem from Museum of Kindness to conclude.
Okay. I'm going to read Trigger Warning. This is the poem that my friend, to whom the book is dedicated, likes the most. Trigger warning. The sun was shining outside, or it was raining. There were windows, but none of them opened. I was wearing clothes, but I was naked that first day back in the classroom after the shooting. The next story we were scheduled to read was The Things They Carried. And when I stood before them and opened my mouth, I gave what was the first trigger warning before I knew what such a thing was. The story had guns and violence in it, and I didn't know if they'd want to read it now. Should we read it, or should we strike it? No answer. I asked again. Silence. They were looking through me as though I were the window, and I was looking at them like they were a door with an unanswered phone ringing behind it. They wouldn't have names anymore because I was afraid to love them. Finally, somebody said, "We don't care." Nobody disputed this. I was silent for a long time. Then I got my paper cup of coffee, raised it to my mouth, and poured it down the front of my blouse.
It was Susan Elmslie reading Trigger Warning from her second full-length collection of poems called Museum of Kindness, in anticipation of her reading at Landon Library, Wednesday, February 20th, 7:30, for Poetry London. Susan, I'm just so grateful for the opportunity to have spoken with you.
Thank you for this really great conversation.
Thank you, Susan. Bye.